like my women like I like my COVID-19 and easy to spread.
Dun 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 dun.
You know, the best part about COVID-19 jokes is that they never get old, just like school shooting victims. Wanted to talk a little bit just about how fishy all this seems. I've always had this real simple litmus test when dealing with conspiracy theories as to whether or not there's any validity to paying them any attention and looking into them. And the vast majority of conspiracy theories that are floated out there do not wash. But it's simple and it's very practical. Is there money somehow involved? If the answer is no, then it's probably just someone's made up paranoia. If I hear that the reasoning behind some big global conspiracy is boiled down to the same kind of motivations one would expect from Skeletor or Shredder from the Ninja Turtles, I'm not likely to believe it. People aren't motivated from a sense of evil and being, having their strings pulled by satanic Illuminati, all that kind of stuff. That's storybook kind of shit. But if there's a cash money return on what's going on, and if someone stands to reap a huge profit, then yeah, in those stances, it's not a guarantee that a conspiracy theory is accurate, but there's at least a hint that there might be something there, and it's worth looking a little bit more into. So, of course, we come to our corona apocalypse that's going on, and for the most part, there hasn't been much being floated around in, the nefarious motives of the powers that control the global economic banking system and all that kind of stuff. Which is interesting, for people who, in all sorts of different ways, spends years making a big protest about how we hate fascism in all its various forms. It's kind of funny how everyone quickly knuckles under as soon as the government comes in and tells us to do something. So, is that one of those we protest too much kind of things? Kind of akin to, the homophobic people who turn out to be gay themselves kind of stuff? I don't know, you tell me. I've long wondered about the left's recent obsession with Nazism and what that says about them, because they keep seeing that behind every shadow. But that's neither here nor there. On the surface, because of the stimulus package and the fact that yes, and even in the worst of times, someone's going to be making some money off the situation, that there are people who want to say that everything that's going on around the world right now and shutting down the economies and closing off borders between countries and now in states, that this is also a sign that there's a secretive cabal of uber-rich trying to make more money off this. I don't think that's actually very accurate. I think the money that's being poured into the situation is probably not enough. In truth, if this drags on too long and the major world lending institutions stop fronting each other credit, that could collapse the value of money itself. So in the long term, none of these institutions have any motivation to do this to themselves. Protecting their money or trying to make more money is useless if you devalue your money entirely and it just becomes a bunch of paper nothing, or if the internet ends up going down and then all that electronic money that's out there just doesn't exist, poof, blinks into nothingness. Now, I have trouble buying that, and as far as international conspiracies go, there's just too many unnatural bedfellows that all seem to be on the same page about what's going on here, so once again, it's hard for me to really find an angle for any of this. I have one, and I'll get to it towards the end, but it's a weak argument. The main thing that makes me feel like something is fishy going on largely just comes down to the fact that so many of our leaders keep using war language. We're at war. We're in a war footing, it's not like peacetime anymore. They keep making those kinds of statements. And then also saying stuff like, the invisible enemy is amongst us. The invisible enemy has invaded our shores. I've heard those words out of politicians' mouths. And that's just extremely Orwellian sounding. Like, even under the worst case scenarios of the COVID-19 virus, with 80% of the population getting it and millions of people dying, that's still not a war. No one's shooting guns at us. COVID-19 isn't trying to take our territory or our resources or strong-arm us into signing a treaty. That is not a fucking war. And it's not the invisible enemy. What are these? They're not ninjas, okay? Bacterial ninjas are not out to get us. Calling it the invisible enemy, I don't know. It just, every time I hear that, I'm like, oh, I just really wish they would stop using that language, because it triggers something that makes me start wondering, like, what exactly are they covering? I think the most likely thing that might be being covered up is that this is actually going to be way much worse than they're portraying, which would explain why it seems like we're overreacting. They're just trying not to start a panic. All the stuff when Trump was saying he wanted to be open back by Easter, I don't even think that was aspirational on his part. I think that was merely just him throwing some meat to the stock market to give them something that they can trade on. Because as I said, if this drags on too long and everyone stops lending each other money and extending lines of credit on a global scale, then money itself loses its value. It becomes meaningless. We'll have toilet paper, at least, because all that cash we have on hand is not going to be worth a shit. So you might as well use it to clean up your shit. But they keep saying things like invisible enemy. So I don't know. If there is one thing that could have been accomplished by doing this to the entire world, that would get all these various factions and powers that would normally be opposed and struggling against each other to all get on board on this one thing, it's just down to the simple basic math of how pandemics work, and that the only way they can protect themselves, because most of the world's super rich and super powerful leaders of both industry and government, they're all in that age category that is most vulnerable to the virus. And the only way they can protect themselves from it is that they can't isolate themselves perfectly. There's still chains of people that they have to have contact with. And so the only way to protect themselves is to shut everything down and force all the common folk to be quarantined. Except they can't enforce a full quarantine. So they got to do what they can to make us, paranoid that we're all going to die, in a terrible fever dream while we're choking to death with an oxygen tube down our neck. And they'll hammer, on and on about the need for a lot of medical supplies and stuff. Sounds like, for the most part, if worst case scenario, our medical needs are mainly going to be shovels and places to dig graves. Assuming that any of this is even as blown up to the point that they think it's going to be, because there are issues, as some doctors point out, that we're kind of just like scooping anything that's vaguely COVID related into the COVID death statistics. The thing that actually killed you might have been an ongoing lung issue you've already had, but you had COVID-19 in your system, so they're going to class it as a direct cause of death being COVID-19. This is something that's similar that happens with statistics about AIDS in Africa. There are a lot of, pandemic levels of AIDS in Africa, and has been for a while. However, it's not like they're over there testing every last single person in Africa with AIDS tests to find this out. In order to be able to inflate their numbers so that the various organizations and charities can get increased funding to help their efforts to quash the AIDS epidemic in Africa, they will often basically just kind of swoop in anything that seems vaguely immune deficiency-esque, all under the greater categories of HIV, and then present that number as a way to get support for their cause. And similarly with the COVID-19 thing, we're in a kind of a danger zone of it already seems to be being done to some degree, or not, at least from what I can tell, that anything that can be loosely classified as COVID-19 is being classified as COVID-19. Why? The profit motive is kind of shot. I don't think the entire planet, why would China be wanting to help Trump get elected by bolstering his numbers, or why would Trump be going along with a plan that will help Bernie Sanders get elected because he's the promotion of medical care for all? like I said, there's just too many unnatural bedfellows all tied into this and all kind of on the same page. So generally, I tend to want to assume then that this is actually a legitimate crisis. But they keep using war language and invisible enemies. And, yeah, I have issues with that. So anyway, I guess a little local news here in Texas. Discovered last night. Watching a press conference from Greg Abbott, our governor here. And my God, I cannot wait until we can find a different governor and lieutenant governor for this state. Various leaders have kind of, throughout the country, have kind of shown their qualities in terms of actually being able to lead in the time of actual genuine, crisis when people are actually really nervous. And some people are good at it, and some people suck. And Greg Abbott, no thank you. I'm not saying it from any sort of anti-partisan kind of basis. Just purely just observing him as a person. That's not the kind of dude that I want to have in charge of me in my life when things are going bad. But anyway, though, he had a press conference, and Texas is basically cutting itself off from the rest of the country. We're not going to be allowing any incoming travel from California, Washington State, Louisiana, and a good chunk of Florida. So, huzzah. And I heard Rhode Island was also cutting off traffic from New York, so it's not like we're alone in that. He did, though, have this whole thing of had created an executive order to countermand the guidelines to release prisoners, to make an emphasis that we're not going to release dangerous criminals. He wasn't specific about what exactly he meant by dangerous criminals. That's vague language. Already had been stated in what was happening with the various penitentiary institutions and prisons releasing people is that you're releasing the safer inmates. You're releasing the people who are in there for nonviolent crimes. So if we're only releasing people for nonviolent crimes, they're not dangerous anyway, and we're keeping the dangerous people in anyway. So either this is highly redundant, or because of the vagueness of dangerous, it's widening the scope of what that means. Yes, it's not right to keep full prison populations pinned in a giant box so they can all get sick and die together. But at the same time, in the midst of all this economic chaos, allowing them out, where are they going to go? There's no jobs to be had. Where are they going to live? Everyone's supposed to be being quarantined and staying away from each other. I mean, some of the lucky ones obviously will hopefully have family or friends who will take them in, but that's not a guarantee for all of them, so I don't see how that's just not potentially increasing our already ballooning homeless population. And Austin has a lot of homeless people, and daily on my route to work over the last several years, I've kind of come to know the regulars of my section of Austin's homeless. And I've been seeing some new faces lately, this last week or so. So, take that as it is. That's just a casual observation. And just one little slice of America. But the math works out everywhere, not just here. So I'm sure that's going to be a thing. And yeah, just we're in a tough situation here. There doesn't really seem to be a right answer. Probably because the problem is not, this isn't a question. A virus is not a question, so there's not really an answer in that way. Only time. I do worry a lot about this country. This country makes me very nervous. I'm not talking about the government or the parties even. I'm talking about the population of America. We're twitchy. There's a lot of things about us that we never really acknowledge or talk about in our media and just kind of pretend are not there. But this country has always had a very vast criminal underbelly. There's this whole, half the population doesn't vote and is never really addressed because of that. And, yeah, I'm nervous for the future, so they're going to have to keep dumping money on us as long as this goes on. I don't think honestly, the April 30th thing, I'm not sure if that's going to be realistic. the projections out of MIT about how long this is going to take to fully cycle through the human population and be over with is like 18 months, and we're just a couple weeks into that. No one wants to say that, because that's yet another thing of telling all the major investors in the world that business is going to be crashed for a year and a half. They're going to stop investing, and that's going to further degrade the system and lead to, as I say, as soon as the major global lenders stop lending, money becomes worthless. And hopefully they understand that their own wealth is dependent on that they have to keep loaning that wealth out, otherwise it's not wealth. But if they fear that they're never going to get paid back on it, that becomes a problem. You start holding back on wanting to lend, and there's a critical mass point that just becomes too much. So, yeah, I guess we're all fucked. Anyway, y'all have a good Monday, or whatever day it is when you watch this. And remember, we don't need another hero, because you got King Waspinator. Hit like and subscribe.